we had prior sexual trauma, and this was why we were out at the age of 15, 16, dressed like baby hookers and thinking, oh, it's embarrassing to still be a virgin. Look at the status I've got. I've got this older guy who everyone wants. That's a powerful feeling. But if you have to flip that on your head and go, that wasn't fine, he took advantage. I was too young. I was a child. He took advantage. If you have to go from that position of power to that position of weakness, that is going to be horribly painful. Guys were benefiting from our sexual trauma, and it was a cluster. So hello, you wonderful human of the internet, and welcome to a video about the inescapable culture of age gap relationships and underage sexuality on the early 2000s goth and alternative scene. And I really want to thank my friend Kitty for giving me this video idea, that we were talking about what was in our nostalgia boxes from back in that era. And she showed me a picture of the pin badges that she had from that era. And we were talking about how weird it was, the things that were expected from us in those days, that you were expected to be so sexually experienced, that age gap relationships were never side-eyed. If anything, they were thought of as very cool. And then I saw Kitty's pin badges, and it was a real moment of kind of cognitive dissonance for me. I remember when I was young, I would have seen these and thought, wow, you're really cool, you're really sexually experienced, you're really mature. But then seeing them now as an adult and thinking you were wearing these as a child, like the age of consent is 16 in the UK, but nonetheless, you're still a child for 2 more years and you're still very, very young. And some of the slogans on these badges were things like, I'd do anything for a fuck, slut, wow, what a big cock. The badge that really creeped me out the hardest is the one that actually sounds the most innocent until you kind of peel back the layers. And it says, I did it and I did it good. As in, I got rid of my virginity and I pleased the guy I was with, is what I read into it. But the creepy thing is that this badge is like in pink and yellow. It's got a childlike font. It looks very, very kind of infantile. It looks like a child's happy birthday badge. And it's, I did it and I did it good. Something about that, the childlikeness with the sexual overtones, just, ooh, that culture we were in when we were young was not necessarily healthy in many ways. But I think the thing to start with is that age gap relationships and underage kind of sexuality and all of this, it wasn't just on the goth scene. It was very, very heightened on the goth scene. But it was kind of everywhere in the early 2000s, that if you look at a lot of the kind of movies and TV shows of that era, you will see so many high school girls. And I can think of a very clear example, which is Cordelia in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, talking about, oh, high school boys are like, ugh, they're so lame. That, you know, they're not cool. They don't have cars. They're all pimply. They're shorter than me. They're not cool. I'm going out with a college guy now. And if you could bag yourself a college professor, it wasn't seen as like, dude, that's like, he's a creep. You're so young. What the hell? It was seen as, oh my God, like you're really mature. If you can get a professor interested in you, you must be really mature. And he's got a car, he's got money, he's got a house to go to. It was a very, very different culture. But then if you take that culture and you also add goth stuff into it, that obviously goth was a lot further back in its evolution in the early 2000s. It was a lot closer to its roots, and its roots kind of being the punk scene with, you know, rebellion, breaking all the rules. That on the goth scene in the early 2000s, it was very uncool to be seen following any kind of rule. And therefore, keeping your virginity even until it was legal. I remember, like, this is just awful, but I remember at the age of 16, I'd only turned 16 a month ago, I think, or maybe 2 months when I lost my virginity. But to me, it was a great source of shame to still be a virgin at a legal age, that I felt I should have lost it when it was underage, because that's another rule to break and that's cooler. And I think another element of this that's really easy to witness from the modern day is the movies and media of the early 2000s, and the fact that it is all fixated on high school kids losing their virginity. So think like the whole American Pie series, like the whole thing is, oh my God, we can't go to college and still be virgins. That is the biggest source of cringe ever. So they're all like, they're determined to throw it away on prom night. They've got to get rid of it on prom night or the social pressure is just going to be awful. You had movies like The 40-Year-Old Virgin where it's like, if it doesn't happen to you in high school, it's never going to happen to you because everyone's going to think you're weird. Like there was so much pressure, even in mainstream society, to not be a virgin when you were young. And yeah, the rule-breaking stuff with goths, it was intensified big time. Like none of us thought about the fact that these rules, they're not just there because, you know, the stiffs and the straights have kind of imposed them on you and they're dull and they're boring and they're your parents like imposing boring shit on you for no reason. None of us thought about the fact these rules are in place to protect you. They are there because older guys sleeping with you when you are a child is creepy. And if he will do it with you at this age, how young will he go? You know, we didn't think about these things at all. And, you know, I think a good example of this is the term jailbait. That these days it's become almost a dead word. And only really very old guys seem to use the term jailbait. And even then it's like it's a warning. It's like, don't go there. It's not worth it. Whereas in the early 2000s, there were perfumes, there were eyeshadows, things like that called jailbait because it was almost aspirational to young people. Because what it meant, what you saw in this awful word was I'm young and I'm desired and I'm hot. And this was like, what more could you want in the world than to be young, desired and hot? Like it was your ticket to everything. Being jailbait, it was your ticket to everything you felt like. And it's kind of a very outdated thing, but I'm thinking like how much of this, I need a man to get through life, kind of awful kind of 1950s, 60s ideals, how much of this was still dribbling through into the world that if you felt it was so important to be young, hot and desired and to bag an older guy who had the car and the money and the house and all of this, was it some kind of like aspirational, I've got my life sorted because I've got this guy kind of thing? And I don't think that's how any of us were thinking consciously, because that would have been our parents' thoughts and that would have been therefore very uncool to us and we wouldn't have wanted that. But subliminally, I feel like that was still kind of there for us a little bit. But I think as far as this culture of underage sexuality on the goth scene goes, I think you can compare it these days to how a lot of goths feel about right-wingers, that like you can't be right-wing and a goth. They are just ideals that do not mesh. And we very much felt the same in the early 2000s about being a virgin, about being sexually choosy, about saying no to sex. It was like you can't have these ideals and be a goth. It's about breaking the rules, and BDSM very much crossed, I suppose still does cross over with the goth scene, but particularly back then there were a lot of BDSM nights that goths would attend that would play goth music. Obviously BDSM fashion was a really big part of the goth scene. I think because of the fact that there wasn't so much specific gothic clothing out in those days, if you wanted to dress goth, a lot of your clothing came from BDSM stores and sex stores and all of this. So you ended up looking like a kind of bondage hooker. And that was certainly one of my styles when I was that age. And therefore people kind of expected you to walk the walk if you were going to wear these clothes. And I don't know who was putting this onto us. And obviously a lot of people are going to say, oh, it was the guys putting it onto you. But I feel like a lot of this expectation we put on ourselves as females on the goth scene, I feel like a lot of the expectation, it kind of came from ourselves and from each other. That these days people will say, I don't wear makeup for men, I wear it for myself. But if you take this back to about 10, 20 years ago, most women would say, I don't wear makeup for men, I wear it for other women, to kind of feel good around other women, to bond with other women, to kind of compete with other women, I think was the unspoken thing. Like the envy factor and the competition factor seemed to be very, very intense on the goth scene at that point. I think because of gothic elitism, essentially, that we had been told you kind of have to be as goth as possible. And part of the values of being as goth as possible, it wasn't just, listen to the music and be knowledgeable about the music. It was also this sexuality thing and this bondage thing and this, you have to look as experienced and as done up, and you have to be able to walk the walk. You have to know about bondage. You have to be into bondage. And some of the things we expected from ourselves at such young ages were really, really stupid. And I remember when I was like 15, there was a big fashion for bondage tops, like tops with straps on them, jeans with straps on them. And I was like such a child at this point that I genuinely believed if you were going to wear these tops, you had to know how to be tied up in them. You had to expect to be tied up in them. Like it was a genuine show of like, yeah, I'm into this, tie me up. It's like, no, honey, it was literally just a top. It's not that deep. Don't read into it. And I just have to mention here that it is so ironic that we had these assumptions and beliefs about the goth scene and ourselves, that we felt we had to be able to walk the walk as people who were kinky at all times in all situations. And yet, if you ask any goth girl, be that back then or now, something that really annoys them about non-goths, it will be this very same assumption that if you are a goth girl who's ever been on a modelling website as a model, you know you have had some absolutely foul requests where people basically think you are a bondage prostitute and an extreme submissive, and they will ask if they can put electrified labia clamps on you and penetrate you while you're on this, in quotations, photo shoot, and they don't even want to pay you for it. And it's like, where are you getting this from? Well, the place they're getting it from is us, essentially. We were the ones back in the day putting it about that, oh yeah, we're also kinky and we're also sexually experienced and we don't say no to anyone. So next time this happens to you, younger goths, you know, when you're on a dating website, this also happens. You can have a totally innocent dating profile and you will still have a whole load of men coming along saying, can I be your slave, please? I'll live in the shed. Can I be your slave? So if this kind of stuff pisses you off, I'm sorry. It's basically my generation's fault, because we were so fucking insecure about not being as goth as possible that we just mangled up what goth was and put it about that you had to be so kinky, and now it's being reflected back at us from non-goths who believe this about us, and it drives us crazy. It's a hot mess. It's just tragic when you look back and you think you were such a child and yet you had these expectations of yourself. So to get on to kind of my own experience of age gap relationships and the age gap relationships of the time, I do still know people to this day who are married to their age gap relationship. And some of these people had like a huge age gap and they're happily married to this day. So obviously not all age gap relationships went wrong. Although these people now, they will get young people when they find out that actually they met when, say, they were like 15, 16 and their boyfriend was like in his mid-20s. Kids of today will be like, you were groomed. You're still groomed. You're married to him. Like, what the fuck? And I don't know how to feel about this. As someone who was there at the time and who remembers the culture of like, but it wasn't, no one thought it was a thing. And happily married is happily married. But I think if you are in this situation and if you ever have kids, I think you really do need to do some soul searching and to think, okay, it worked out for me, but how many people did it not work out for? And was it really right? And yet, when I think back to my own age gap relationships, the weird thing is that I remember how cunning and manipulative I was as a 15, 16-year-old, that, as I say, being a virgin was a huge source of embarrassment to me because of this culture on the goth scene of you mustn't follow the rules, you mustn't be seen to be a virgin or to be vanilla. Yes, if you were seen to be vanilla in any way, like that was, your reputation would be wrecked. So I think a lot of people getting into age gap relationships and having their first sexual experiences, I think a lot of particularly girls probably had horrible first sexual experiences that even though pornography wasn't so widespread back then, we put this expectation on ourselves. So even if they consented initially to sex, it's quite possible that there would have then been acts pushed on them that they were not remotely ready or willing to participate in, but they just felt so strongly that they couldn't say no. And that's quite horrible and quite scary. And I was very lucky that that was never the position I was put in. Not really. Although, thinking about this and just thinking about making this video, I kind of have been realizing how icked out I was by sex at the time that I lost my virginity, that although I was very cunning and very manipulative, and I lied to the guy, that if you've read the book that I put out last year about kind of my youth and about all of these experiences, you'll know I lied to the guy I lost my virginity to and told him I was already sexually experienced. And further down the line, it turned out actually that he had lied too, and he'd never been all the way with the girl either. So both of us were so pressured by the culture of the goth scene at this point that we both lied about being sexually experienced. So we lost our virginity to each other in a way that could have been very innocent and very like, how's this for you? And we could have had that experience together and been like, this is so new. How are you feeling in this newness? And I think that would have been so beautiful. And instead it was like, oh yeah, I already know what I'm doing. Like, jaded is the vibe of the goth scene. I know what I'm doing. We've been here before. This is just like a throwaway thing to us. And fortunately, like, it didn't turn into that. We did fall in love after that and we did spend a long time together. So it is still a good memory to me, my first time. And I think I'm very probably rare in this culture that so many people felt they had to just toss it away and pretend to be sexually experienced. But like, say, my kind of sexual ick factor was still there. That I did very much have to push through feeling icked out by sex. And until thinking about this video, all my life, I've just thought, look, being icked out by sex is just a part of me and it's just who I am. That if you've read my other book, The Putrescent Vein, the name kind of gives it away. It's a very kind of grotesque book. And there's a lot of sexual grotesquerie in there that some of it is like, okay, just how grim can we get with this? I'm just going to throw myself into how grim we can get with this. But there's another story in there called The Vagina of Apocalypse about a guy who is terrified of vaginas. And this story kind of came from my own sexual icks that, as I say, I felt like I was just someone who was icked out by sex. And I've always thought, you know what, if I grew up on today's goth scene where asexuality has become the cool thing, that it's, the way to break rules now is almost to say, no, I reject this massive history of groupies, of underage sex, of feeling pressured into sex. I reject all of that. I reject the patriarchy. I reject being seen as a sexual being as my only worth in life, and I'm just not going to have sex. And obviously, asexual people, that is their sexual preference. But also, I feel like it's this rule-breaking thing to an extent. The reason that we can now do it on the goth scene is because it's seen as rule-breaking, and therefore it's become quite a cool thing. So I feel like if I was on the goth scene now as a youngster, and asexuality was the cool thing rather than like being sexually promiscuous as a cool thing, probably I would have let my sexual icks run wild and I just would have gone, you know what, sex grosses me out. I'm never going to do it because I'm allowed to never do it on the goth scene. But while I was thinking about making this video, I kind of had a big, horrible aha moment and thought, dude, maybe you were so icked out by sex at the point you lost your virginity, not because it's innate to you, but because you weren't ready, because you were a fucking child and you shouldn't have been doing that. And if you had have waited, maybe those sexual icks would have just gone away naturally. And maybe they wouldn't still be kind of a part of your brain to this day. And I think to get even darker than this, you have to look at, okay, age gap relationships, underage promiscuity on the goth scene. The big question really is, who do you blame? And the obvious surface level answer is, well, you blame the older guys who were taking advantage of the young girls. And to an extent, yes. But to my mind, think about what goth guys are like, and certainly think about what goth guys were like back then. That I know these days on the internet, there is this representation of goth guys as being some of the guys who you will see as big social media people. Most of them are very, very outwardly confident. They're very conventionally attractive. A lot of them identify as real life vampires or polygamous or both. So they're there with like their harem of gorgeous women. They're talking about, yes, I feed on all these women because I'm a real life vampire. And they're very, very charismatic and very hypnotic. And I think people think, oh my God, goth guys are like this. No, these people are the tiny, 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 tiny minority. I would say I've only met, in all my years on the goth scene, I've met one goth guy who was maybe slightly like that. Most goth guys, and certainly of the early 2000s, they were kind of computer geeks. The biggest profession on the goth scene is always in IT. You meet someone on the goth scene, generally speaking, particularly if they're male, they're going to be in IT. So you've got a lot of computer geeks. They were into like Magic the Gathering cards. They were there in their frilly shirts. They were people who'd been bullied and picked on just the same as goth girls. A lot of them were neurodiverse or had mental illness. They'd been picked on. Their self-confidence had taken a huge battering. They weren't confident, cocky guys who were there really to take advantage of girls. If anything, I think a lot of guys on the early 2000s goth scene were hugely intimidated by the culture of goth girls at the time, that, you know, we did look like kind of bondage hookers. We were there flaunting this sexual experience that we didn't really have, that we were faking this sexual experience. We were faking our kinkiness. And yes, goth guys would feel that they were reaping the rewards of this when they were the one walking around town with this gorgeous, powerful looking woman. And she was going home with their like frilly shirted, geeky ass. You know, they were the one who got to go home with her. And yes, obviously they loved that power trip. But when it came to goth guys and hitting on these women and to actually seducing these women, like I don't think I've ever really, certainly particularly back then when we were all so young, I don't think there was ever a situation I could have remotely dubbed seduction in the ways some of these older guys would hit on me. One of them was so nervous, he kind of crept up to me on the dance floor and tapped me on the shoulder, like said his name really quickly, dumped something in my hand, and he basically ran. He just ran away. And I was like, the fuck was that? And I opened my hand and he'd given me his number, but he was so afraid of rejection. He hadn't stuck around for the answer. It just said, call me if you want, no problem if you don't. And I've still got that bit of paper because it was so meaningful to me at the time. So that was one of them. He was so afraid. And then when I phoned him to say, yeah, let's go for a date, he still thought he was being pranked. He thought, you know, no, I don't believe it's you. Your voice is really deep. I think you're someone else. And I had to convince him that, no, I was actually the person from the club that he'd hit on. So that was one goth guy. There was another goth guy who was gorgeous and I had a huge thing for. We never got together and we both wanted to. We admitted years later, but neither of us had the balls to talk to each other. So that was one. Then even the guy I talked about in that book, who I described as a fuckboy, and he kind of was a fuckboy. He'd slept with over 100 women at the age of 28. I think that denotes a fuckboy. But even this guy, as far as confidence and seduction goes, we just saw each other around clubs for like weeks and weeks, and, you know, we'd kind of interact. And it was ages before he actually kind of asked me out. And even then it was an indirect thing. It was kind of, you know, oh yeah, I hear you do certain things too. Can you kind of come round and help me out with these things? It was very indirect. There were no like seductive, predatory guys that I met on the goth scene. I'm sure I know they existed. Yes, it's right. One has just popped into my mind. Yeah. Okay. So there were some who had issues, and these were the guys who were a lot older. The guy I'm thinking of, he was like 30 when I was about 15. And he was out there hitting on the girls who were in my age range, dating. There was kind of this running joke that he'd slept with everyone on the goth scene, girl-wise. He'd slept with all of them. And if they were young, yes, he particularly liked them. And the crazy thing is that we didn't even really see him as like a predatory creep. It was just like, oh, that's just what he's like. He's just a bit of a slut. You know, that's just what he's like. That was how blind we all were. And in part, I think it's because the scene was so young at the time. We were all so young that the only people old enough to say this is wrong were the older guys who were there to be predatory. So there was no one to enforce fucking anything, because we were all kids bailing on our parents and going out to these things that, you know, our parents were very free and easy with us. I think my generation, certainly mine, you know, as I've said in the book, you know, they would just let me go clubbing at the age of like 14, 15, 16. I would go clubbing. They would give me money to go clubbing. It's like, what are you going to spend it on? Booze, obviously. But there was no thought about it. It was just, my parents had always said, you know, we're not going to crush her spirit, was kind of what they decided when I was born. And that just meant we're never going to set any rules. We're never going to set any rules. And I don't know that that was really such a great way to parent, but it certainly gave me an interesting youth. But to get to the dark part of this, again, who do you blame for all of this? So the older guys, yes, there were some who were predatory. The majority of age gappers, though, the younger age gappers, so guys around the age of, say, sort of 18, 19, 20 to 23, dating kind of 16-year-old girls, they benefited from this awful culture. But I don't know that they were the ones really instilling it. And obviously, if you go back further in history and you look at other subcultures that were quite rebellious, so you look at kind of hippies of the 60s, kind of glam rockers of the 70s, hair metal people of the 80s and 90s, you had like the culture of groupies, and that it was really cool to sleep with older rock stars and all of this. So this culture in every rebellious subculture, up to kind of now when feminism has suddenly become cool, and it's like, yeah, you can own your sexuality. You can say no. It's cool to say no and to know what you actually want. This is the thing. Back then, it was seen as, yeah, you know what you want because you're saying yes to everything. You're breaking all the rules. You know what you want. But it wasn't that. These days, it's like, no, you have to know what you really want. If you want to say no, you can say no. If you want to say yes, you can say yes. You shouldn't be shamed for being a slut. You shouldn't be shamed for being a virgin. And that's, oh my God, that's so freeing. And we didn't have that. But again, who do you blame? And I thought about this yesterday and I had a really horrible aha moment that I thought, look, I don't blame the age gap relationship guys I was with, not even the very first of them, who was 21 when I was 15. And yeah, he was a sleazebag. And yes, I still have memories from that time. I still don't blame him because I was the one who went and hit on him and who pursued him like crazy. And yes, you can't take the blame as a child. I'm not taking the blame. I'm saying the blame came from the people who shaped me before that point. So there were specifically older guys who, not on the goth scene, I'm talking adults here, who had thought it was perfectly okay to comment on my tits from the age of 11 or 12. Like, I developed early, 11 or 12, I had boobs. And despite knowing my fucking age perfectly well, these guys thought it was perfectly okay to comment on my boobs, be that in private, in very private circumstances. They felt it was fine to comment and more on my boobs. Be that in a restaurant with other people. Like, there were no holds barred with these guys. The minute I'm not repeating the terminology that was used to me at that age that just shook me to the fucking core at that age. And there was actually a woman present on one of these occasions, and I could see her face was like, and I don't think she said anything because I knew her quite well, and she also clearly had some sexual damage. Let's just put it that way. And I think she kind of went, whoa, that was horrible, but it's how men are. So I put the blame on essentially the boomer generation guys who had taught me from the age of fucking 11 or 12 that my sexuality was theirs for the taking and was basically my value in life, that from a very young age, from 15, 16. And honestly, this is something I'm still trying to break out of. I have viewed my worth in friendships as transactory, depending on sex, as in no one is going to put up with you unless you're putting out. This is the poison that was kind of given to me by these boomer guys when I was super young. So honestly, it's the sexual damage that you already have, that these young girls who, like me, are incredibly cunning, manipulative, or seem that way. We will pursue older guys. We will lie to older guys about our age, about having lost our virginity already, because we think it's cool to have those things, and because we think we can have those things, and we think we're ready for those things. And essentially, it's who do I blame? sexual abusers who came before those guys. My big personality essentially being weaponized by previous sexual abuse, that I'd been taught this is your value in life, this is what you are, you're ready for this, you were ready for this at 11, 12, people were commenting on you at 11, 12, so you were obviously ready for it. So now you're like 15, 16, you're like behind the curve, you should have lost it already. Like, so of course this like 20-year-old guy belongs to you and you should be able to have him if you want to. And you know, if you've got a big personality, you can be weaponized so easily. And then, of course, that becomes perpetrated on the goth scene to other girls in amongst ourselves, that I think many of us did come from this kind of place whereby we had prior sexual trauma. And this was why we were out at the age of 15, 16, dressed like baby hookers and thinking, oh, it's embarrassing to still be a virgin. I've got to wear pin badges that tell everyone what an experienced sexual person I am, even though I'm like a fucking child. And, you know, when you get enough girls like that together, they're going to believe that this is right because it's normalized. It's completely normalized to them. And therefore it becomes a rolling cycle. And girls who come onto the scene who are even younger, well, this is the culture they're coming into, is this is so normalized. We're fine. And I think something that was really interesting was seeing Emily Boo's story time a while back about her age gap relationship as a teenager and how it wasn't until recently that she realized that wasn't just a cool older guy, that was grooming. Fuck. And had to rewrite her whole memories. And I think she was incredibly brave for doing that because it's so much easier to own, in a way, to own your mistakes as like, yeah, I wanted that. I chose that. It was fine. That doesn't trigger any emotions in you. But if you have to rewrite those emotions, you have to say, that wasn't fine. He took advantage. I was too young. I was a child. He took advantage. That fucking hurts. That's upsetting. That's upsetting just to say, let alone to genuinely, to your core, believe and have to rewrite all your memories. That is painful. And I think that is something that you need to understand and to just bear in mind if you are younger and someone in your life, maybe your mom, maybe someone who's an older friend, is or was in an age gap relationship that they got into when they were very young. And you're thinking, you were groomed and this guy that you're still with, he is your groomer. You need to get away from him. And they're going to be very resistant. And I think what you've got to bear in mind is the amount of pain they're going to have to go through if they ever admit to themselves, this was wrong. I was a child. He took advantage. I was a victim. If you have to go from the powerful one, because this is how we see and saw ourselves at the time, was we were the powerful ones. Look at the status I've got. I've got this older guy who everyone wants. You know, again, taking it back to groupies, they felt they had the power. Look at who I've got. I've had, you know, Steven Tyler or whoever. I've had him. That's status. That's a powerful feeling. But if you have to flip that on your head and go, I was a victim of a horrible, horrible patriarchal culture and of both the guys who abused me when I was young, but then the guys who I thought loved me, I was abused by all of them. If you have to go from that position of power to that position of weakness, that is going to be horribly painful. And honestly, like, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a therapist. I don't know what is better. If you get to the age of late 30s, early 40s, and you're, you know, all your life you've had this belief that you were fine as a child, that nothing terrible happened to you. Yeah, you had some weird relationships, but they were fun ultimately. If that's the belief you've got, and yeah, there's some underlying damage, but it's not affecting you right here and now, probably. Is it healthier to keep rolling with that underlying damage, or is it healthier to rip it off, have a huge breakdown over it, and then try and heal eventually? Like, I don't know. Is it just better for you to keep tiptoeing over the scars and to just never admit that there were scars at all? I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a therapist. If you are, please drop it below. Like, does it do you any damage? Probably it does if you're, you know, in your late 30s, early 40s, and you've never admitted to yourself that there was a problem here. Like, say, my own kind of perpetual sexual icks about certain things. Did that come from sex when I was too young? And it's something that I should have grown out of before having sex, rather than locking my mindset about sex in this childlike kind of bleh, sex is a bit icky, but you've got to do it to seem cool. Like, I don't know. So it's a very, very dark thing once you start peeling back the layers. It's like, wow, yeah, the goth scene in general was so rife with sexual abuse victims that we were making ourselves into even more victims and not even knowing it. And the guys were benefiting from our sexual trauma. And it was a clusterfuck. You know, everyone's looking back on these early 2000s. Oh, more goth aesthetics. Oh, it's so lovely. Oh, doesn't everyone look young and innocent? And yeah, it's like, yeah, we were young, but we weren't innocent because that was taken from us. And it was deeply fucked up in many ways. I think the lucky thing is that probably most teenagers are not going to walk the same path that I did with age gap relationships and with feeling you have to be so crazily sexually experienced at such a young age and lying about your virginity in order to lose your virginity younger than you're even ready for. I think hopefully most people don't walk down that path now because of the fact that age gap relationships are side-eyed like so hard now. Even when it's like a 16-year-old girl with an 18-year-old boy, which was so normal back then and was even seen as like the desirable thing, really. It was always like, oh, girls are more mature than boys, so like a bit of an age gap is kind of a good thing. And, you know, he's got more experience. He's not going to be so awkward. Whereas now even that kind of age gap is a little bit for people. So fortunately, I think, you know, all these decades and generations of groupies and underage sex and hippies and free love and all of this stuff that essentially was piggybacking on girls with sexual trauma. And suddenly we've turned it around, and that's really cool. But when it comes to this kind of thing and parallels in the modern era, I do feel there are still dangers for young girls at the moment, particularly with like pornography becoming so widespread. I think a lot of girls, their first times are horrible now. And you see it in TV shows, you know, you saw it in things like Euphoria, that there are so many guys who like the things they expect from particularly like a young girl, that they do expect like hard hair pulling and choking and spitting in her face, and if she's crying then she's maybe enjoying it because that's what the fuck has porn done to people? This, you know, maybe when you're more experienced and yes, when you've had the discussion about this is what I like and this is what I'm into, but to just automatically expect that from like a general sexual conquest is so fucked up. And guys don't seem to know it. And actually a lot of girls, I feel like there's probably a lot of girls who, just like me, had the prior sexual trauma and therefore feel, you know, porno girls do everything and they never say no, and guys expect this from me. And if I'm like crying mascara tears down my face and choking, he's going to be turned on by that, and that's to be expected because that's what guys in bed are like, because that's what I'm getting from porno. And that's so fucking disturbing that honestly I feel like our generation, despite the age gap relationships and despite how dubious that was, compared to some of the shit that people have to go through because of porn, I feel like certainly I got off very, very light compared to what a lot of girls go through because of porn. Again, I think probably most of the girls getting into this and ignoring their own icks and ignoring their own, oh, this feels wrong, it's because of prior sexual abuse. You're so used to ignoring what feels wrong, and you're so used to maybe being comfortable in feeling wrong that you go, oh, this is fun. This is long now, and this is getting dark, and we're kind of off the subject of the 2000s onto now. But it just seemed relevant. So yeah, I don't know. Tell me your thoughts. Were you a goth from the early 2000s with this crossover with the BDSM scene, this need to seem experienced and the need to break rules, and it all kind of oozing out of the groupie eras? That, it was such a mess in so many ways? Or are you a young person of today and today's culture, I mean, fuck me. I think actually that the early 2000s on the goth scene was not half as, obviously was not half as bad as the emo MySpace scene. You know, the things that were acceptable on that kind of scene, that was, I mean, bleh. What's his name? Darby Vanity and his band. And you hear some of the lyrics that in his songs, and it's also childish sounding, the music, and then there's these lyrics about just like and the things that he did to girls, and I mean, I don't know whether that was how it always was for groupies, and it's just the first time that it's been like captured in social media, and that those girls have actually told their stories and said this is how it really is, or whether the MySpace scene was particularly toxic. I do think it was particularly toxic. So if that was your scene, I'd be very interested to hear about that, and I'm sure other people would too. But yeah, early 2000s, it was not all like a haven of fantasticness. It was actually meant to be more of a light-hearted video about like, oh, this was a bit silly, wasn't it? When we, you know, in the early 2000s, we had these silly beliefs. It was a bit silly. I should have realised it'd go very quickly down a very dark rabbit hole. Okay, well, I have to try again at making a light-hearted video next time. Everything seems to be very dark at the moment. I don't know why. But anyway, thank you for listening. I'm going to shut up now. If there's more things you would like me to talk about, please leave them below. If you have any ideas at all, I'm intrigued, because taking this idea from Kitty has been really, really interesting. So I'm eager to plumb your ideas box too. So tell me things. But thanks for listening. Over and out. Bye-bye.